Hello, I'm Dr. Ashley Bell, and I recorded this video to help you understand what you're about to see in your brain analyses. What I found is that this can be quite a lot of information to try to take in one sitting. Not to mention, it can be a bit complicated. So, this video will give you a basic understanding of how to interpret your brain images, as well as how this information will be used to design a neurotherapy program that's based on what your individual brain needs. So I'll also delve into how neurofeedback and neurostimulation work and how they can be used to address any imbalances in the brain that we find. So, this way, I hope that this will give you a foundation of understanding so that when you come in for the review of your assessment, we can really focus our time on looking at your specific brain patterns and exploring how those relate to your personal experience. And of course, answer any other questions that you might have. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen with you. This is an example of the brain report you're going to receive. I'm going to go over a couple details from it now so that when you're looking back at it, you'll understand what you're looking at. Okay, so when we're looking at your brain assessment, we're looking at the raw EEG, which is the electrical activity of your brain. Now, that electrical activity fires at different rates, okay? So we have these different frequencies. And what a frequency is it's basically how many times is that firing within a second, okay? So how many cycles per second, that makes a frequency. So for example, here under our alpha range, you can see where it goes up and down. And if we counted that, we can say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So that is 10 hertz, okay? And so that's what creates the frequency in the alpha band. Now we're also looking at the morphology, which means the shape of the brainwave, and that does matter as far as determining whether it's theta or alpha. As you can see, we have 8 hertz in both of them. So we would want to determine which is which so that we can get specific with your training program. As far as you're concerned, you don't need to worry about those nitty-gritty details. That's more so we can get really specific in your training. But I like to go over what we're talking about when we're saying frequencies and frequency bands. So our frequency bands are delta, which usually ranges from about 0.5 to 3.5 hertz, sometimes up to 4. Theta goes from around 3.5 up to 8 hertz. Alpha is 8 to 12, beta is 13 to 30, and gamma is 36 to 44. So you can see that delta, these are the slowest frequencies. Delta is basically the most inactive state in our brain, the most unconscious. So we tend to see this a lot during sleep, but if we have too much delta during our awake state, that can indicate an impairment in that part of the brain where it's essentially inactive when it should be up and running. Okay. Theta is where we're getting into a bit more of our drowsy state. So it's not as inactive as delta, but it's still on the slower side. We tend to see this with the state right before we fall asleep. You know, if you get that imagery, you start to kind of see things as if you were dreaming, but you're not all the way asleep. That tends to be a theta state. So we also tend to see this in things like hypnosis. It tends to be associated with deep meditation and creativity and intuition. So as you can see, you know, theta is not a bad thing, but we do want enough of it and we don't want too much of it. Any deficiency or excess can create some issues. Looking at alpha, we divide it into 2 different levels. So the low end of alpha is really a very internal state. It's still that slow end of alpha. So it tends to be more of a awareness of self. We can see this in really deep states of mindfulness meditation. And in excess, it can actually signify that the brain is idling. Okay, we actually tend to see more alpha occur when you close your eyes because when you close your eyes are no longer taking in information. So then the visual areas in the back of your brain go into this idling state, waiting to come back online. However, sometimes when we have impairments in certain regions of our brain, they can also go into that idling state and they're not coming out the way they're supposed to. Okay. In the higher end of alpha, we're just getting a little bit more of an outward awareness, but still mostly internal. It's associated with calm, attentive states, also with mindfulness, but a little bit more aware of our surroundings versus that really deep meditation. Okay. We also tend to see these frequencies in what are called flow states. So, a lot of artists and athletes like to produce more alpha waves to assist them in their performance. Getting into beta, this is where we divide it into three different levels. The low end of beta, 13 to 15 hertz, tends to be an ideal state to be in when we are trying to focus. It's something that throughout our day to day processes, we should be in a dominant low beta state because a lot of times we're needing to, listen to things, we're needing to take in what other people are saying to us, we're reading, we're working, and all of those tend to require that low beta frequency. So as we get into the faster beta frequencies, this is where we get into more mental activation. So, of course, this is helpful when we're really trying to problem solve or really thinking through things. Um, but if we have too much of it, it can start to contribute to things like anxiety or rumination, where something gets stuck in your head and just goes round and round. So, we want this in a certain level so that we can focus, but too much of it can create too much of a good thing. So wherever we see too much beta, it can create issues related to whatever that part of the brain is associated with being overactive. Gamma is another brainwave frequency that's very interesting to look at. It tends to be associated with integration of thoughts and ideas. It's perceptual binding, and a lot of people believe it has to do with insights, especially when you get these like genius insights out of the blue. Sometimes that can be a burst of gamma. Okay. So we tend to see this a lot during the learning process. However, our technology is not going to be looking specifically at gamma. We can see it in the raw EEG, and we can also train gamma with our neurostimulation. But you won't see it on your color maps because the technology is not currently where it would need to be to distinguish that from muscle tension, because sometimes muscle tension in our EEG can look very similar to gamma waves. Okay, but I like to give you that information just so that you understand what gamma is. And if we do any gamma training, you'll know what we're doing. Okay, this page is giving you definitions, which we'll be going over, but it's something that you can look back at later. And then this is going to be explaining about the SW Loretta 3D imaging that we use, which I'll also be explaining in a moment. Okay, so now if we look at the raw EEG, you might recognize this from when we recorded your brain assessment, because this is the raw electrical activity. Now, just understanding the basics of this, each of these lines was from one of these sensors on your head. So each of those is reading the electrical activity from each location on your cap, okay? And I don't expect you to understand this whole raw EEG, but you can see that there's kind of a mixture of different brain waves. So, for example, these are alpha waves. These here that are kind of low amplitude and really jaggedy, those are beta waves. Okay, we've got some theta waves mixed in here. We've got beta spindling, okay? That's a different type of beta. So you can see here that our brain is actually producing all of those brain waves all the time. Okay. Sometimes it's a misconception that if we're producing beta, for example, that we're not producing theta, or that if we're in a theta state, we're not producing alpha, for example. And so we are producing all of them all the time. Now, different brain regions might have different frequencies that are dominant. And the key is that we want them all in balance, not too much or too little of any of them. Okay. So the next step is we are taking what we find in your raw EEG, and we are comparing that to others your age who are high functioning individuals. So these are people who have been tested for neurological and psychological impairments, and they've been found to be very healthy. Okay, so we're looking at where does your brain differ from these other individuals, and how might that be contributing to your symptoms? Okay. So when we look at this, this is our quantitative EEG, and you see here that we have a scale. So this scale is like our bell curve, okay? So we've got our standard bell curve, and the center of that bell curve is the average of those healthy individuals. But then we've got a range of healthy activity. So you don't have to be exactly in the center. You can be anywhere within that range, and usually you're pretty high functioning. But when you're far outside the range, that's when oftentimes it's contributing to a symptom or a challenge. And that's what we would want to address. So on this scale, you can see that the center is green, and anything that's within that greenish yellow or greenish blue, that's all okay. That's within the healthy range. However, as we move up into the orange and the red, and then if we were to see some of the darker blues, those would be the concerns that we want to focus in on. Okay. So in this sample brain assessment, we see here are our frequency bands. So we've got delta, theta, alpha, beta, high beta, slow waves up to fast waves. And this individual is showing a little too much of this beta. Okay, so this is the low end of beta, whereas this is the higher end, the fastest frequencies. Okay, so we'll explore that a little bit more in a moment, but this is absolute power. That means the actual activity that's picked up under that electrode as compared to the ear electrodes. So you'll remember you had some electrodes snapped to your ears. And what that was doing is those ear electrodes will pick up the environmental stimuli, just like the ones on the head would. But when you subtract the ears from the head, then you just get brain. It's a way of factoring out environmental electric noise, okay? Now, the relative power is looking at how one frequency compares to the others. So, for example, we can see this one's a little bit on the higher side. This is yellow. So we have more beta than, for example, delta. Delta is a little more on the bluer side. So we have less delta than everything else. Now, because our absolute delta is actually within healthy ranges, that's not really of concern. But we do look at that when we need to for more information. Down here we have amplitude asymmetry. Amplitude asymmetry is a measure of looking at overall balance within the brain. And we can see, if brain regions are a little bit off balance from one another. So because we're comparing this to other individuals your age, we can see where yours differs. And we know that, for example, in the front of our brain, we should actually have more alpha on the right side than on the left side. So it should be like this, okay? Now, if it was like that, that would mean too much asymmetry. That would show up as a red line. If it's like this, that means not enough asymmetry. So that would show up as a blue line. So here we see a couple brain regions that aren't differentiated enough, and we have a couple here that are a little bit too differentiated, okay? So that helps guide our treatment as far as the overall balance goes. Then with coherence, that's our main connectivity metric. So that's how we're able to see how are these brain regions communicating with one another? How well synchronized are they? And in this case, we have not enough. So blue, not enough. We see that these brain regions are basically disconnected. They're not communicating the way that they should. If we have red lines, that actually means that they are too connected. They're attached at the hip, okay? And normally we think of connectivity as a really good thing in the brain. However, if you have too much coherence between brain regions, it often indicates that at least one of those brain regions is not operating the way that it's supposed to. So it's not able to operate independently enough and is having to recruit help from other brain regions. So, for example, if we saw that the front of the brain was hypercoherent, meaning had too much connectivity with somewhere in the back of the brain, then that's going to really slow down our processing. Because in order for the front of our brain to do what it needs to do, it's having to reach all the way across to the back of the brain and come all the way back in order to accomplish its task. Whereas our brain is really specialized for a reason because that improves its efficiency of processing. So we want our brain to be operating as fast and as smoothly as possible, as well as staying nice and balanced. This last line, phase lag, this is a measure of timing. It's looking at point A to point B. How long does it take, and how does that compare to average individuals? And this is an interesting technology. However, as of right now, we are not paying a lot of attention to this one just because it's very new. So these first four lines have been really tested for what's called test retest reliability, meaning that if we took the assessment today and tomorrow and a month from today and even a year from today, all of these other measures should stay consistent as long as there wasn't some significant thing that happened in your life or a brain injury or anything like that. This last line, because it's new, it seems to change a lot. So I would take it today and tomorrow, and this would look different. So we're not putting a lot of emphasis on this, and you can go ahead and ignore that one for now. Now, these frequency bands, we also break down into individual frequencies to get a lot more specific. Now, first of all, that reveals what's really going on behind the scenes, because when you average out all the frequencies into a whole band, sometimes it can kind of dampen the effect of certain ones. So, for example, in our alpha range, we've got, 8 up to 12-ish. And the 12 would be dampened by these others that are looking fairly normal, and we wouldn't know that we've got an issue there. Okay, so with the individual frequencies, we can see more detail about what's going on behind the scenes, and it allows us to get very specific with your treatment protocols. So as far as you're concerned, you don't need to worry so much about, is it 15 hertz, is it 13 hertz, too much, too little. Basically, if we see imbalances here, if we have too much of 13 hertz and it's related to your symptoms, then we're going to work to reduce 13 hertz, okay? So that's how we design some of your training protocol is what we're seeing here in these QEEG maps, these quantitative EEG. So for example, this is our nose, these are our ears, we're looking down on the top of the head. And we see here that this individual is showing too much of 12 hertz in that left temporal part of the brain, so behind that left ear, okay, and some on the right as well. This would be in the back of the brain and some of the visual regions, also related to some of our brainstem activity and emotion centers. And then this here, we've got the core of the brain is really fired up in this individual. So those regions often are related to our emotions and fight or flight responses, our pain, a lot of different variables like that. So this is our first assessment, and it gives us our first clues as to what might be behind the scenes to what you're experiencing, especially what you're struggling with. And then we also look at what's called Laplacian, which is basically just a different way of localizing activity. So remember I said the first one is comparing against the ear electrodes. This one is actually comparing the activity under one electrode to the average of the surrounding electrodes. So it's just a different way of really localizing where is that activity coming from primarily. Where is it the strongest and the farthest outside those healthy ranges? Now, this one also reveals some more connectivity stuff where we see, oh, okay, so this brain region is really having some issues between it and other parts of the brain. It's really imbalanced. Again, we would look at individual frequencies on that, and that would allow us to get very specific. So that's the QEEG that you're going to see. And then we take it a step further in looking at what's called the SW Loretta. So this is the fancy software. This is where we're really getting detailed on where that activity is coming from in the brain. So here we have a 3D image, and this head is here so that you can kind of understand what the brain looks like. So this is the front of the brain by the forehead. This is behind our ears, that's the temporal lobe. In the back, this gets down into the cerebellum. One of the benefits of the Loretta technology is that we can get down to those really deep regions like the cerebellum or the limbic system. A lot of times our symptoms, especially things related to mental health like anxiety and depression, PTSD, a lot of those are really deep in our brain. So we need a technology that can read that activity accurately and target it during our training process. So fortunately, the SW Loretta software allows us to do that, whereas a lot of the traditional neurofeedback approaches did not. Okay, now let me remove this so we can get a better look at the brain itself. Okay, now up here we see the frequency. So this is 1 hertz, and then these are the brain regions that are outside that healthy range. Here's our scale down here. So in this case, we're looking at anything outside 2 z-scores, which is a measure of the standard deviation. It's how far outside that healthy range. Okay, anything beyond 2 is usually associated with a symptom. Okay, so with this, we're able to get really specific. We're able to see that, oh, okay, so we've got some imbalances, especially down here in the cerebellum, where it's actually producing too many slow waves. Okay, if we go up in frequencies, we're able to see others that start to show up. So we also see similar patterns in 11 hertz, okay? And these are all the brain regions outside the healthy range. Now you'll notice we also have numbers here, 20, 46, 21, okay? These are what are called Brodmann areas. So Brodmann areas are basically a different way of breaking down the brain into chunks so that we can get really specific. So we're looking at 52 different Brodmann areas, and then we are also looking at those limbic areas and different parts of the cerebellum. Now, just to give you a little more education on the Brodmann areas, a guy named Brodmann dissected a bunch of brains, and he separated out the brain according to clusters of neurons with the theory that those clusters shared functions. And it turns out he was right. So the Brodmann areas are also considered functional brain regions where we can say, okay, Brodmann area 4 tends to be associated with motor movement, motor activity. And the 1, 2, 3, these tend to be sensory. we can see that, okay, 9 is related to a lot of our higher level processing, like decision making, planning. It's associated with abstract thought. So, this allows us to say not only the prefrontal cortex, which is actually quite large, but we can get so specific that we can target specifically that 9 or that 10 or whatever brain region is out of balance. This is the outside of the brain. This is the inside. It's as if we were to cut it down the middle and look in on that half. Okay. So that is a map that you're going to have as part of your assessment to be able to look at the Brodmann areas in your brain that are outside the healthy range. You can also look up the functions associated with those regions. So, for example, on this one, we have 46. So you would be able to look here at Brodmann area 46. And see all the functions associated with that region. You'll see that there's actually quite a lot of functions, and a lot of these brain regions are like that. They have lots of different things that they're involved in. So when I go over the review of your assessment, I'm going to give you a basic overview of what that brain region is associated with and how that might relate to your symptoms. However, this is a document you'll definitely want to look back at and see all of the different areas where that brain region might be impacting your functioning. Now, not only is that good for you to have a better understanding of yourself and kind of validate what you're experiencing, but it also is something we can track over time. And we can see that if you are struggling with, say, working memory, we can track that and see how your working memory improves over time as we improve the functioning of that brain region. Okay, so that's the Brodmann areas that you're seeing here on the assessment. And we'll be listing out the ones on your brain assessment that are the farthest outside the healthy range. Now, just for continuing to give you an example, here now we're getting into these faster frequencies, and this is where we see activity starting to show up in the deeper regions of the brain, as well as up here. So again, we're going to look at which ones are the farthest outside the healthy range. It's going to pinpoint it for us. That's Brodmann area 5, okay? And we can also look and see that, oh, there's actually some activity on the inside in that core of our emotion center, okay? Now, we take all of this information and we will compare it to what you're actually experiencing. We'll say, okay, so are the functions related to Brodmann area 5 related to some symptoms that you're experiencing? Okay. So if it is, if we see dysfunction in the brain and it's related to your symptoms, that goes into our training program. So this is where we're getting into the neurofeedback component, where we would take all these brain regions and say, okay, so Brodmann area 5 at 19 hertz needs to come down. Okay, Brodmann area 4 at 19 hertz needs to come down. 23 at 19 hertz needs to come down. Each of those forms a metric that goes into your neurofeedback training program. So you can imagine that we end up having quite a lot of metrics that we're training in your brain. That's why we need a brain-computer interface like neurofeedback, because obviously I would not be able to keep up with what your brain is doing in all of these brain regions, but the computer can. So what we do is we take all the brain regions that are outside the healthy range that are contributing to your symptoms, and we put them in the software. And you can imagine this as if we had this big globe, and here's all your brain metrics. And then here we have a smaller globe on the inside that is the healthy level of activity for each of those metrics. Now, oftentimes your brain is starting out here. So we are going to nudge your brain and train it to bring its activity closer and closer to that healthy range, step by step. So with the neurofeedback, we train your brain similar to like we would train a dog when it does what we want. Okay. So with a dog, you get it to sit, you give it a treat, the dog learns to sit and it keeps sitting, right? The brain is very similar. We start out here. We say, okay, brain, I want you to bring all of your brain metrics one step closer to that healthy range. And when you do, you're going to get a reward. Okay, now how do we reward the brain? We have to find something that's of interest to the individual, and we have to communicate with it in the language that it speaks, okay, which the majority of the brain speaks in the form of sensory cues. It doesn't understand language. It doesn't even understand reason. It understands our senses of vision and taste and smell, hearing, okay? So oftentimes for the training, we use something like a movie, okay? And this is a movie that you get to choose. So we even have integrations with things like Netflix and YouTube, and you can choose whatever you want to watch, whatever you're motivated to watch. And then because you are motivated to see the movie, or you're motivated to at least pull it on the screen, then your brain is going to interpret this movie as a reward. Okay, so we connect that movie to your brain activity, and the software is reading your brain activity in real time, so that when your brain brings that activity one step closer to the healthy range within the threshold that we've set, then the movie zooms in. And when it pops outside that threshold, the movie zooms out. So with that, every time you're able to bring it full screen, then your brain interprets that as a reward and ingrains it so that it remembers it for the future. Okay, in the same way, it's learning what not to do when it zooms out. Okay, so that's how we start to train your brain down a new pathway. We dangle the carrot. When it gets to that first step, then we reward it, and then we take it another step and we say, okay, now you need to bring it one step closer here. When you do, you get that reward. Now we'll decrease it one more step. Okay. So we do that until we get all those metrics within that optimal range of activity. So that's how the neurofeedback works when we're doing the SW Loretta neurofeedback. That's the most advanced technology out there now, and it tends to produce the quickest results and the most effective results, because we're able to get so specific, so targeted, and we're able to target multiple brain regions and frequencies all at the same time. Now, with that, we're also able to train connectivity better than we could with any other technology. So, for example, this is what we're seeing as far as connectivity here. This is where we can see some of the brain with it, and we can see that these brain regions here are hyperconnected. Again, that means that these aren't operating independently enough. They're having to recruit help from the others. And then we also see that there's a lot of brain regions that aren't talking. They're not communicating well enough, which is really breaking that flow of information. So with the Loretta technology, we're also able to train this point to this point, and this point to that point, and all of these different brain connectivity metrics. We're able to get them to also come within the healthy range. And what we're finding is that connectivity is as important, if not more important, than the actual amplitude of the brain activity. Okay? So that's how the Loretta neurofeedback is going to work. And then the last piece that I wanted to go over with you in this video is the neurostimulation. So we offer a few different types of neurostimulation here, and the main ones we utilize are the transcranial direct current stimulation and transcranial alternating stimulation. Now, when we say stimulation, that doesn't always mean that we are activating. Sometimes that can be perceived as we are boosting activity, we're stimulating it, right? However, with neurostimulation, we have the capacity to get very specific as to whether we want to activate or deactivate, or which specific frequency we want to put into the brain. So with the direct current, that tends to be more of an on or off, okay? So we can boost brain regions that are underactive, we can calm brain regions that are overactive. That type of neurostimulation actually works with the neurotransmitters GABA and glutamate, okay? Now, with the alternating current, that's where we can put in specific frequencies. So, for example, if somebody was deficient in alpha brainwave frequencies, then we would be able to help their brain produce more of those frequencies, which tend to be more of a good feely frequency. Okay? So, those are the two types of neurostimulation that we can use to get your brain farther faster. It's kind of like we're showing the brain the way, and then we're removing the training wheels and saying, okay, brain, it's time for you to do it on your own. Okay, so this is where the neurostimulation and neurofeedback work very well together because the neurostimulation shows the brain the way. It also tends to make it more neuroplastic. It primes it to be able to change, breaks it out of its stuck patterns, and then we go in with the neurofeedback to really fine tune, rewire, and get everything nice and balanced. Okay, so that's how we can use the different neurotherapy modalities to help balance whatever imbalances we find in your brain assessment. The most exciting piece is that we actually get to track your brain's progress over time. So we will continue to do those update assessments throughout the process to see as your brain is changing. This is where it gets really exciting because you can see as things that were overactive start to come down or things that were underactive start to come up, and you have that tangible evidence. This isn't something where you're like, well, is it working? Is it not? You actually get to see if it's working. So, for example, these are just a few of our samples where this was their pre-assessment. This was post. You can see that they had all that dark, dark blue, really deficient, and relatively a lot higher beta in the center there. And that all came nice and balanced. You see that, in this individual frequencies, we had a lot of fired up activity. And this was their partway assessment. They weren't even done, but it came down pretty significantly. Here again, we had some excess beta, and over time that cleared up. Okay, so we'll get to do that with your brain and see how your brain changes over time. Okay, so I hope this was helpful for providing a foundational understanding of the brain assessments we do and how neurotherapy can be used to help balance and rewire the brain. Like I said, this will really allow us to just jump right in and talk about your specific brain and the specific recommendations that we have for you. So I'm really looking forward to going over it with you and even more excited to get you feeling and functioning at your best. So thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video, and I look forward to seeing you soon.